Welcome, everyone, to the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange's student webinar series for the fall 2025. My name is Eric Evanson. I'm the Science Communications Specialist here with NAFC. Now, the goal of the student webinar series is to connect students with the fire and forestry community to develop positive working relationships as well as exchanging knowledge. And speaking of exchanging knowledge, I just want to remind everybody that NAFC is part of the Joint Fire Science Program's Fire Science Exchange Network. As you can see there on the map, there are 15 exchanges in all across the country. And if you'd like to learn more about any of the exchanges or the Joint Fire Science Program itself, we encourage you to go to firescience.gov. Now, today, Sam Gilvarg from SUNY ESF will be our speaker, and he is presenting Tackling Tick-Borne Disease and Bringing Back Barrens, Approaching Fire Management Through a One Health Perspective. And the way it will go is we will have Sam give his presentation first, and then we'll follow up with a question and answer session at the very end. Now, if any time during Sam's presentation you have a question, feel free to pop that into the chat, and again, we'll revisit that at the end of the session. And then we will close with just a reminder. We have one more presentation in our fall 2025 student webinar series. I'll share some information on that, as well as ways for you to get involved. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Sam so he can share his screen. And before we get started, Sam, I'd love to have you share your kind of background in fire. You've worked in a wide variety of places, and it would be great for everyone to hear your path so far in the fire and forestry world.
Absolutely, I would be happy to do that. All right. First, my screen is up. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep, there it is.
Awesome. Thank you. So so first I just wanted to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy day to come join us on this seminar, and also thank Eric and the rest of the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange for providing me with this platform to talk about my research and all the great things that are going on in the world of One Health, fire, and vector-borne diseases, specifically in the Northeast in our region. I do have a background in boots on the ground fire management. I started my fire career back in 2016 when I was with AmeriCorps Cape Cod at Cape Cod National Seashore with the Dave Crary's fire program at Cape Cod National Seashore. And I got started doing fire management as an AmeriCorps member there. That summer, following that year experience, I went out to Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, where I worked as a fire effects monitor under Tony Caprio and his crew out in the Sequoias. Which for a East Coast guy who spent most of his time working with pitch pine, the giant sequoias were a bit of it was a different experience, going from a scraggly pitch pine to the General Sherman tree. But it was, great experience seeing how West Coast fire ecology works. But I'm an East Coaster at heart, and so I wanted to come back east. And so after a quick little detour working on an ambulance in the greater Boston area, I came back to my roots and I started working as a fire effects monitor for the Northeast region, now DOI Region 1 of the National Park Service out of Shenandoah National Park, where I worked with Lane Gibbons and, Andrew Ruth out there for the regional fire program. From there, I got a chance to go out west on some wildfire assignments. Went out to some fires down in Texas. Mesa Verde National Park was on a severity assignment there. And after those 2 summers of seasonal work, I spent another season at Cape Cod National Seashore again, working as a fire effects monitor with Dave. And during that season, went out to Oregon, did some fire out there for an assignment of the pretty big fire, the bootleg fire. And, in the whole time doing prescribed fire work, I've done some work as a contractor with some prescribed fire in the Northeast. And currently, I'm affiliated. I've switched from the Department of the Interior to the Department of Agriculture, and I'm currently affiliated as an AD with the Green Mountains and Finger Lakes National Forests. Do a little bit of burning with them, as well as I do a lot of burning with the great folks over at the Albany Pine Bush, where I'm fortunate enough to have a great collaborative relationship, and we have some really cool research going on there as well, which I'm excited to talk a little bit about here. Yeah, so sort of a little bit about everything, but it all sort of came back towards, I mentioned I have a experience with fire, experience working in an ambulance. And so sort of I kind of looked for a nexus of that, interest in health and the environment. And I stumbled across a PhD opportunity here at SUNY ESF, looking at how fire management could be a means to moderate tick-borne illness by controlling tick populations, and how we could coincide that with the restoration of our disturbance-dependent biodiverse systems of conservation significance here in the Northeast. And that sort of got me to a point where I can sort of talk about, how can we tackle tick-borne disease while bringing back these barrens? And I choose to, look at how we can approach that from a One Health perspective. And so with that being said, I wanted to sort of open up this seminar and discuss a couple of guiding questions that I was going to hope that, we could keep in mind as we are going throughout the seminar, where we're going to try to return back to and sort of see how what this research can actually have for an applied management lens. I love knowledge for knowledge's sake. I'm a nerd at heart, but I also very much am in favor of, we're doing all this work because we want to put fire on the ground. We want to, we need to burn more acres. And so these questions are sort of talking about how we can have an applied practical lens to this research. So those questions, what are tick-borne illnesses and why are they a significant public health threat? How can fire management moderate incidence of tick-borne disease? And how can such actions be broadly conceptualized to spur larger conservation measures? And so first, trigger warning for the next slide. There are some pictures of ticks, but this is the tick-borne disease lecture, so hopefully folks are okay with that. So ticks and tick-borne disease. It may be as a surprise for some folks that there are a lot of tick species out there, many more than just, the couple that we have, we are most commonly associated with. Globally, there are about 867 species of ticks that are currently recognized. And in the continental US, around 49 of these have been documented as, infesting or, having a blood meal on humans, but not all of those are common. And additionally, within the US, there are tick species that are very hyper specialized, that do not bite humans at all. I've seen anywhere upwards of 90 species of ticks have been documented in the United States. And many of those are, specialist ticks that go for things like groundhogs or, cottontails or birds. They're very picky eaters, we can say. But of the most commonly medically important tick species that we have in the US, those are also the ones that are the most common, are also the ones we have most commonly in the Northeast. And those include black-legged ticks, which are also referred to as deer ticks in some circles, Ixodes scapularis. There is the Lone Star tick, Amblyoma americanum, and there is the dog tick, which I can never pronounce correctly, so I'm not going to try to pronounce the Latin name there. And all of these tick species have a demonstrated capacity to carry pathogenic microorganisms, which can then trigger disease in humans. And so one thing to sort of think about and recognize is that, a tick doesn't give you a disease. It gives you a microorganism that can potentially lead to a disease. And so it is those pathogens that we need to consider when we're thinking about tick-borne disease. Black-legged ticks do not give you Lyme disease. They can transmit Borrelia burgdorferi, and that Borrelia can trigger an infection, which will lead to Lyme disease. And so when we're thinking about tick-borne disease, it's important to sort of think about it. And, it kind of seems very, very trivial, but it is important because, to fully understand the cycle of this tick-borne disease and how we can break it, we have to understand what the pieces and parts are. And finally, it begs mentioning that there is a huge and increasing tick-borne disease is a huge and increasing source of morbidity and mortality in our region and globally. For example, reported incidence of tick-borne disease more than doubled between 2004 and 2016. Now, when I look at numbers like that, I always think, is this an artifact of that the tick-borne illnesses are actually increasing in number, or are we just recognizing them more and more because we're looking for them? I tend to think that there's a little bit of both there, but with difference with documented changes of abundance, with the sheer increase of morbidity and mortality, I think it is fairly fairly it wouldn't be it is fairly accurate to say that they're increasing because of that huge volume, and this increase has been associated with uh, environmental conditions that have become uh, more frequently extreme, more extreme rainfall, more extreme drought events. All these different extremes have been correlated with increases now and then potentially in the future. And so I now want to sort of shift a little bit to how we conceptualize this disease as an ecological process. And so when people think about disease, we think about it typically from a anthropomorphic or not anthropogenic lens. We think about disease as something that you go to the doctor, you get some medications, and hopefully you're better. But when we're thinking about how fire management can moderate disease, it's not through that traditional lens of you go to the doctor, you get medications, and you're back out there a couple weeks later, hopefully. We need to conceptualize disease as what it is, as an ecological process. Because that's how fire can sort of help to break the cycle of transmission and hopefully moderate incidents of tick-borne illness. And so ticks have a fairly complicated life cycle when you sort of start to wrap into all the environmental factors. But in brief, a female tick will lay a whole bunch of eggs in the environment. And those eggs will hatch into the first life stage of ticks, which are larvae. Typically, larvae are not born carrying pathogens. There's always exceptions. So, it's not a law. It's not a law of ecology. But typically, larvae are not born carrying pathogenic microorganisms. There's no vertical transmission, or we call transovarial transmission, where mama tick gives pathogens to baby tick. Most of the pathogens that ticks have are acquired in blood meals. So if a tick encounters a small mammal like a shrew, vole, squirrel, mouse that has a pathogenic microorganism, it has a blood meal on it, it infests it, well, that tick can become infected with that microorganism. And as it changes life stages, as it molts into the teenage tick, the nymphs, the most angsty of all stages of ticks, those nymphs can also maintain that infection. They can have that pathogen that is capable of causing disease in humans or other animals that they had acquired from that first blood meal. That nymph can go ahead and take another blood meal on another organism, like a deer or a human, or another small mammal, like a shrew or mouse or vole, and it can transmit that infection to deer or humans. And now, one thing I want to just mention is that we often think about deer in the context of Lyme disease, but I should note that deer are poor reservoirs for the Borrelia burgdorferi pathogen that causes Lyme disease. And so I just want to mention that most of the infection, the reservoir, the organism that holds that pathogen in the environment capable of causing diseases relative to Borrelia and Lyme disease are small mammals. Deer are poor reservoirs for that. Just wanted to mention that there. And so after that blood meal as a nymph, the ticks they change into adults, and those adults can then have a blood meal on males. Those male or female ticks can have blood meals on usually larger mammals, but also smaller mammals. Again, here where they can again transmit that pathogen, which is capable of causing disease to humans or other animals. So when we look at this disease process here, when we think about how to sort of combat these diseases, traditionally, we have thought about this on a very, very localized level, compared to things like mosquito-borne illnesses, where there's a larger onus on how can, agencies and governments, communities, combat mosquito-borne illnesses? So without passing a value judgment on how mosquitoes are controlled, when you have outbreaks of, or cases of triple E, other viruses, there's often this, community-wide spraying of, pesticides to control ticks, or to control mosquitoes. We don't see the same thing with ticks. There are individual solutions. So you come down with a tick-borne illness, you go to the doctor, you get, a course of antibiotics. There's talks about getting vaccinations to prophylactically, mediate occurrence of tick-borne illness. We always think about how we can, provide a layer of protection from us with the ticks, proper personal protective equipment, wearing long pants, maybe treated with some kind of a arachicide often. And there's also talks about, how can we, moderate hosts? How can we moderate hosts? In the how can we sort of remove the amount of hosts, which can remove the source of infection and the source of blood meals from animals. But what is not often talked about is how we can actually change the environment that the ticks rely on in order to sort of reduce the tick abundance and therefore reduce encounter risks with disease-causing microorganisms. And so sort of that begs the question, how does fire, which has a demonstrated capacity to affect, tick habitat, tick ecosystems, how does fire affect tick survival? And conversely, how does the absence of fire affect the conditions for tick survival? And so when we have fire in a system that ticks are, ticks are living in, the direct occurrence of fire can cause direct mortality of ticks. Going to have a very, bold claim here that fire is hot and living organisms don't typically like extremely hot things. That's, it's a very, controversial take, but I'm going to stick by it. And so fire can cause direct heating and direct mortality through that heat of ticks. That fire can also lead to indirect mortality of ticks by consuming leaf litter and duff that ticks rely on as refuge from hostile abiotic microclimates and conditions. So fire consumes leaf litter and duff, leaving areas that are more open and sunny and dry, as well as decreasing overstory and midstory sheltering by removing some of that midstory and overstory vegetation, which causes shading and more moisture capacity. And even though ticks will be killed directly after a fire, ticks will also return back to those areas after via animals like deer or birds. Deer are like buses for ticks. They come to an area and they drop off a whole bunch of ticks. And so, when you remove ticks from an area once, it doesn't mean they're gone forever, especially because a lot of animals are attracted to burned areas for the nutrients, nutritious forage that is generated after fires. But the post-fire effects of fire, the post-fire effects of burning, reducing refugia, reducing mid-story and overstory sheltering, can create hostile abiotic conditions that will increase drying, desiccation-related mortality in ticks, because ticks are very sensitive to death by desiccation-related mortality. They have a high surface area to volume ratio, which means they lose moisture really quickly. And so when it gets hot and dry, ticks die. Conversely, when you have fire excluded, you don't have that direct mortality of ticks. What's there is there, and you allow that refugia and more dense conditions to keep on accumulating and spiraling to a level where there's just a lot of you just really improve that habitat. You improve the refugia, which can allow ticks to really thrive and survive. And so I don't want to come across as me being the first person to originate ticks and fire research, because it would not be accurate to say that this is, my original, brainchild. There's been a lot of, interest in this, and there has been some research. However, a glimpse into that literature can reveal some sense of contradictory results. And so some studies have suggested that fire will actually promote tick populations. Other studies think that there is a negligible impact of of fire on tick population size and abundance. Still more suggests that tick fire will impede tick population, will reduce tick abundance, significantly in the long run. And one thing to note when you're sort of conceptualizing these seemingly contradictory results is that fire application here was done at different spatial and temporal scales. So not all these fires were applied, in the same frequency, the same spatial scale, the same intensity or severity of fire. And so there are different sort of conclusions to impact from all these fires from a broad systematic, lens of those fires. If you look at how the studies that have impeded fire, you kind of see the long-term, more landscape scale fire can create really, really significant and substantial reductions in tick populations. So, for example, one study down in Georgia and Northwest Florida found that areas that had received frequent, landscape scale burns had over 99% reductions in tick totals, going from 43 ticks in the burned areas to over 47,000 in the unburned areas. And I don't have to run a t-test or an ANOVA or, generalized linear mixed models to tell you that's a pretty significant difference there. And that has translated to a significantly lower chance of encountering a tick that is infested with a pathogenic microorganism, which I'm realizing I misspelled. So that's my bad. And so fire really hasn't been shown to date to have a significant impact on the presence of pathogenic microorganisms within ticks. However, it has been associated with a decreased chance of you encountering one of those ticks. And one thing I do want to point out here is that the Northeast is relatively a gap in this system. There has been one study in 1998 that I was able to find looking at some tick fire research in Connecticut, but that was a very limited and isolated study in terms of one burn, one moment in time. So the Northeast is a big gap here in this research compared to the Midwest and the Southeast. And so when we're thinking about then how fire can cause ticks to populations to grow or tick populations to stop, we really had to think about the characteristics of those fire. If we're going to stop transmission or we're going to increase transmission with fire, it depends on those characteristics. And one thing I just want to sort of throw out there to have us sort of think about is how that long-term landscape scale fire could be thought about as correlating with historical patterns of fire. And those historical patterns of fire often correlate with historical fire regimes. And so, we're going to return to this idea later. I just want to throw that out currently. And so now I want to return to some current research that is in progress, which is that I'm sort of doing in conjunction with a whole bunch of fantastic collaborators, including, folks at Albany Pine Bush, the resource folks at Brookhaven National Laboratory, as well as my PhD major professor, Andrew Vanderyacht, and my committee members, Dr. Brian Ledet and Dr. Martin Dovchak. So we're studying how ticks and fire, how they interact in the Atlantic Coastal Pine Barrens. And I know a lot of folks are probably familiar with the Atlantic Coastal Pine Barrens, but I do want to just provide a very, very brief overview of this really interesting system. So Atlantic Coastal Pine Barrens are a globally rare association that is primarily found along the North Atlantic coast from southern New Jersey up to Cape Cod. But there are inland examples of that are remnant examples that have, Pine Barrens probably existed further inland before European settlement and land use changes. However, since then, we've lost a lot of our interior barrens. But I do want to mention that, the interior barrens are some of the most spectacular examples of the pine barrens that exist. They're slightly different from the coastal barrens, but I like to, pine barrens, coastal pine barrens, inland pine barrens, Granny Smith apples to Macintosh apples compared to, the pine barrens and oak systems are like apples to oranges. And So pine barrens are typically characterized by a open canopy, chiefly of pitch pine, Pinus rigida overstory, um, that is burned relatively frequently. And oh, my citations, I forgot to change my citations in this one. I have citations for this, don't worry. But that no fire leaves the stand susceptible to encroachment by more shade and moisture tolerant trees. However, burning will maintain that characteristic open structure and promote diverse herbaceous species. So more shade and moisture tolerant species will get sort of moderated by fire, allowing that pitch pine, which is an open overstory system, which allows a lot of light and sunlight to reach the canopy, which has this really diverse layer of herbaceous species diversity, which is really desirable, especially because it is associated with a whole host of faunal species that are desirable. I'm a botanist, so I'm not going to do justice for that element. And so, what am I doing with my research in this system here? So we are dragging for ticks to assess how tick abundance is impacted by fire in these Atlantic coastal systems. Specifically, to date, I've done work at 2 locations: Brookhaven National Laboratory, which is on Long Island, as well as the Albany Pine Bush Preserve in Albany, New York. I have broadly aggregated our study into 3 different treatments of what I call frequent fire. So areas that have sort of a repeated pattern of fire, in the more recent past. And I'm defining that as burned once in the past 15 years and at least once in the past 15 years before the most recent burn. Infrequent fire, which have burned only once in the past 15 years, and control as having not burned at all the past 15 years. And I've sort of come to those conclusions based off of a very conservative reading of the fire history research in the Northeast. Frequent fire can vary, in these different sites, as Albany has had places that burned like upwards of 6 times in the past 20 years. Brookhaven, we're getting there with fire management, but three burns in that time in the past 15 years is sort of what we are working with as a max, and that Albany is probably closer to historical baselines. And we are collecting ticks by dragging. So we have this really fancy rocket science method of getting ticks. We drag white corduroy fabric in the woods. Very complicated nuclear type research there, hard to explain. And we drag the white cloth on the ground. We pick the ticks off with tweezers. We put them in vials of ethanol to retain for later identification to species, life stage, and sex if adults. We record ambient meteorological conditions, and we retain the ticks for future pathogen testing. We're also doing a whole bunch of vegetative structural assessments or a lot of vegetative data collection to assess what those characteristics, the explanatory characteristics of the fire, what those may show for tick populations. So now, without further ado, some very preliminary results that we still need to analyze these a little bit more robustly, fit some models. But as you'll see, the raw results are pretty, they're also pretty revealing. So in this data from the Albany Pine Bush on the summer of 2024 shows that there is a dramatic increase in the amount of adult and nymphal ticks in the no fire control areas at Albany relative to areas that have experienced any kind of fire whatsoever. And so the average number of nymphs in adults that my collaborators in Albany found significantly higher in those those no burn areas, and those error bars represent 95% confidence intervals. Frequent fire is even associated with a marginally significant reduction in ticks relative to infrequent, and so that's a really cool result that really highlights the importance of Albany's work having that fire on the ground, because it really is making a significant difference in reducing tick abundance. And we have data from summer 2025, which I haven't yet analyzed, but it's pointing to a very similar trend as well. And so in summer 25, I also have some data from Brookhaven, and again we have a very similar pattern here that we're seeing, where areas that have not experienced any fire those areas do have a significantly, are associated with significantly more abundant tick abundance relative to both frequently burned areas and infrequently burned areas. Now, one thing I will note here is that if you look at the y-axis, the average number of ticks that we've recorded, Albany has substantially less ticks than Brookhaven, and part of that there's a lot of different hypotheses of why that could be the case. One could be that the predominant tick on Long Island is the Lone Star tick, which is super aggressive and super tolerant relative to the dominant tick in Albany, which is the black-legged tick. But it could also be the fact that there's a larger history of fire and more spatially diverse, or a more spatially ubiquitous presence of fire in Brookhaven, which could, we need to do some more landscape scale analysis to get to the bottom of that. But it could be an artifact of the fact that there's more fire on the ground in Albany, which is leading to less ticks in a larger spatial scale, in addition to potentially being that, the species differences there. Further, when we look at how fire frequency and tick abundance at Brookhaven are in our frequent burn plots, what the association is between the amount of ticks we find per sample unit, as well as the year since the last fire. We really see a pretty strong linear relationship between, as the years since fire, is there more years from the last burn occur, the more ticks that we see. And so the closer you are to that most recent burn in frequently burned areas, you see, fewer ticks. And so what that sort of illustrates to me is that, what's important here is keeping that presence of fire on the land, that cycle of fire going, because, as the time since the burn increases, you're getting more and more ticks. You really have to reset that system with frequent fire, which we know is an ecological good in these systems to promote the species that we need. And so, if we look at sort of the amount of, control ticks, if we want to sort of impede the presence of those ticks, maybe burning every, on the long end, every 5 to 6 years could help us, maintain significant reductions in tick populations. But, we need to sort of have a little bit more detailed analysis to get to any, firm recommendations. Also, with that being said, we do have some future analysis and work that we need to do with this data as well. So we'll be doing some pathogen testing to see, is there any changes in pathogen abundance associated with any of our variables, fire or, vegetation otherwise? What is the response to that vegetation to fire? So, can we promote, is there any, can we see any patterns in promoting the desirable barrens communities? Can we maximize barrens restoration and judge that by vegetation characteristics, and also maximize tick reductions? And also, as I mentioned, what are those landscape scale impacts of fire? And now, what I want to shift in sort of how we can maybe go about, conceptualizing this fire management and a way to sort of realize these objectives. And I'm a really big proponent of One Health as a guiding philosophy, and integrating wild and fire into One Health. And so now you might be asking, well, what is One Health? And that's a great question. And so One Health is an interdisciplinary methodology that seeks to find and implement interventions that can benefit the health of humans, animals, both domestic and wild, plants, and their shared environments or ecosystems. And so we want to sort of look at how we can have these, how we can have these win-win-wins, with the same interventions. And One Health really does have widespread applicability, though it is often most considered in the context of human and animal health. So, for example, One Health has a demonstrated capacity to really be ideal for dealing with zoonotic disease, which is the spillover of pathogenic microorganisms that cause disease between animals and humans. And so a good example of a zoonotic disease that has made, an impact in all of our lives is COVID-19. So COVID-19 most likely spilled over from a wild animal source to humans. And, the traditional, approach for how to deal with diseases like COVID is let's make medications and a vaccine, and that's how we deal with the issue. But a One Health oriented approach would look at the problem differently. It would say, well, what is the root cause of this, which is humans going into wild areas in order to get animals and other things to support their livelihood. And that going into those natural areas can provide to degrade those natural areas can hurt animal health, and also can lead to the spillover. So how can we get to the root cause of those, of that problem, which is the socioeconomic impoverishment of some communities? So a One Health oriented approach is like, how can we improve those socioeconomic conditions, which will then improve the health of the environment, animals, plants, and people. And One Health also has a significant applicability for antimicrobial resistance as well, which is a really big issue. We want our antibiotics to stay effective. And I would say what the prescription for our fire integrated One Health is that alignment with historical fire regimes that I mentioned that we would return back to previously. And sort of quickly to define a historical fire regime is the overarching past pattern of a fire for a given area, which consists of factors like, the historic past seasonality of the fire. So they burn in the spring or the fall, the growing or dormant season. Or what is the spatial heterogeneity of these fires? Do we have fires on, 2 or 3 acres at a time? Or, do we have, 1,000+ acres burning at any one moment? What is the intensity severity of these fires in the past? Were they relatively cool fires? Or were they, like hotter fires? How severe were these fires? Did they consume a lot of biomass, or did they, just kind of scorch the top surface and kind of just, do their, kind of just mosey along slowly? How frequent were fires? Do they occur every year, every 3 to 4 years, every 100 years? And what were those pre-burn conditions? Do we have open barrens full of grasses, or do we have really densely packed, densely stocked systems that burned? And not all of these characteristics are equally important for a particular system. So it's important to recognize what is most important in your given system. And what sort of we contend is that this alignment with historical fire regimes, misalignments will lead to more extreme fires and negative health impacts, whereas alignments with historical fire regimes can lead to more positive impacts or the moderation of negative health impacts. What I sorry. So here's my another warning. This next figure I like to joke around and call the motion sickness figure. But what we hypothesize as aligning historic fire regimes. The more you align, so the more of those boxes you're able to check and get closer and closer to historical frequency, the more maximum health benefits you're likely to be able to align. And so if you have completely ahistoric characteristics of your fire regime, you're likely to have more negative health impacts. Conversely, if you're able to, have at least the frequency correct, well, you're going to get probably more benefits. If you can align frequency and seasonality and frequency and intensity, we're getting somewhere. We're probably going to start seeing more and more, more and more benefits, but getting closer and closer to those historical conditions. And now you might be asking, well, how am I going to get to this? This is all great in theory. How can we go about doing this? And what we, propose is something that we call the FIRE process for achieving fire integrated One Health. And so to do this, you want to find a health issue and find a health issue and sort of evaluate how, effective this has been addressed in the past. And we want to sort of, that's related to fire. We want to investigate that issue and try to connect it to a departure from historical fire regimes. So what can we learn from, the past fire record and how that is different from today that could, piece together what is going on here. And we want to relate that issue then to broader health issues, health outcomes, and goals. How can we, what is the, the health outcome, the negative health impact can be an environmental one, animal one, plant health, human health thing. But how can we take that, maybe, focus issue and expand it to other kinds of other issues of value? And then perhaps most importantly all, we want to engage that. We want to apply that fire management solution. It's all well and good to talk about doing this, but, a critical component of this process is actually going about engaging that solution, applying that fire, and then in sort of an adaptive management type approach, going back and reevaluating sort of, quality assurance, quality improvements. And so let's do a case study now about, how this can apply to Barrens restorations. So bringing back that Barrens that we talk about at the title of this presentation. So our issue, declines in pine barrens post fire suppression have led to mesification, which is, the gradual shifting of of um, forests from more moisture tolerant, moisture species to taking the place of, fire tolerant, drought tolerant species, and that's a problem. We're losing biodiversity, and we're also likely creating these fire infrequent systems that are less tolerant to projected future disturbances. And this is also creating a loss of habitat for species of conservation concern. I did the wrong citation there. I apologize. So now let's investigate. And so these problems have been, are able to sort of be associated with like a loss of historic disturbance stream, perhaps most notably through systematic fire exclusion and systematic suppression. And so we need to use fire to restore desired disturbance in many communities, as well as other mechanical adjuncts like overstory thinning and other types of things in some circumstances. So now how can we relate this to other issues? Well, maybe that fire that restores barrens can promote, the size of, can moderate the size of tick populations. And by doing so, maybe that will decrease the risk of encountering pathogenic microorganisms. Maybe this will promote habitat for species of conservation concern, like the Carner blue butterfly, and then, promote the health of an animal species. So maybe that fire that we have to promote, those species, maybe that, the health of those species. And then how do we engage this solution? We got to burn. Maybe that involves burning at varying intensities and severity to promote those open, barren structures. Maybe we need to augment, as I mentioned, those burn efforts with mechanical fuels treatments. Albany does a fantastic job at this. And maybe when we want to utilize growing season fires to kill woody vegetation, and thus promote that, open structure that those desirable herbaceous species need, that are characteristics of those barrens that we know are globally rare, as well as create, conditions that have a demonstrated capacity to be hostile for tick survival. And now you might be wondering, just why bother? Why bother with fire integrated One Health? What's the point of conceptualizing it in this manner? Well, I would argue that collaborations break disciplinary silos and allow for novel ideas and solutions. We may be doing something one way because it's working pretty well, but who knows? If we get into a room with an epidemiologist, we get into a room with a wildlife ecologist, with a chemist, maybe that novel collaboration, which One Health is so big on, well, maybe that brings a new idea that we never considered before because, a fire ecologist talking to fire ecologist. Maybe this novel idea that comes from that collaboration could be a game changer. I would also argue that framing fire management through a One Health perspective could maybe, incentivize fire management, the ability for fire managers to gain the support for their work. No one likes ticks. You don't have a big tick lobby saying we want more ticks. It's pretty unifying paradigm there. There is a one of my sort of sayings. As long as the robust statistical analysis prove this point. So one of the diseases that can be transmitted or acquired through tick-borne tick infestation is alpha-gal syndrome. Alpha-gal syndrome is red meat allergy. And so if I can go up to someone and say, you can either barbecue your woods, once every couple of years, you can't barbecue on 4th of July because you get a red meat allergy. Well, then maybe we can start talking about getting fire on the ground more because, a lot of folks who enjoy their steak, they don't want to lose that from a tick bite. And so maybe if we can frame it like that, we'll get more incentive to burn. And finally, who knows that this could provide more funding opportunities. And so, can we, leverage public health, sources of funding to also promote ecological restoration and vice versa? Can we use these can collaboration maximize resources, and thus, expand the range, the scale of our efforts. And now, with all that being said, I just wanted to open up the floor to, we have 15 minutes left. I wanted to open up the floor for questions, and also do a shameless plug for a recent publication that some co-authors and I worked on, that was published this June in the journal Bioscience. They have a whole upcoming One Health issue coming out. So, please check it out. And if you need access to it, I am more than happy to send you a PDF of that document.
All right. Thank you very much, Sam. I've got, we do have some questions in the chat. Before we get to that, I do have one quick question. In your process of the dragging for ticks, is there a certain amount of area that you need to do for each location that you go to for it to be relevant?
Sure, yeah. And so to try to keep the playing field even, I'm trying to do the same amount of sampling efforts across the sites, across all my different transects and treatments and stands. And so I have been sampling in 160-meter units. And so we have a 1 meter drag, and we drag that 1 meter, 1 meter drag 10 meters, we stop and check, and then we drag another meters up until 160, whether that's a vertical transect or a horizontal plot, we have that same units, and importantly, or the same effort, the same amount of dragging, and importantly, we're going to the same areas multiple times throughout the season to try to capture a more comprehensive look at that stand, that site, because maybe that one day was just a bad tick day. Maybe the conditions were just so poor that no ticks were out, even though there's a lot of ticks there. Or the opposite could be true. It's just a perfect tick weather, and it's bringing everyone out of the woodwork. So we're trying to sample, more frequently, or trying to sample frequently, but also that same amount of effort, so we can, compare apples to apples.
Okay, great. Thank you for answering that. All right, a few questions here in the chat. First one's up from Amanda. I'm pondering the connection between the spatial extent of fire and the movement of ticks in the landscapes you studied. How do the ticks you measured move across the landscape, both at Brookhaven and Albany Pine Bush?
Yeah.
And in terms of fire, were the treatments fairly similar, mowed versus unmowed fuels, burn unit size? And from the plots you measured, how do you scale up conclusions about prescribed burn impacts on ticks at both landscape scales at Albany and Brookhaven?
Yeah, so a lot of great questions. And so I may actually repeat a few of them because I can only think so fast. So the first question was looking at how ticks move across the landscape. And so indirectly, and so tick moving across the landscape really is associated with the host that they're on. And so tick ranges can be thought of as, ticks themselves, they only go a couple meters, on their own if they're feeling really, really, adventurous. But when they hitch a ride on the deer, their range then becomes whatever range the deer has. And when ticks are finished with the blood meal, they'll detach and fall wherever the deer is. And so the tick range, that's the ability for ticks to move spatially across the landscape, is directly correlated with the ability of their hosts to move across the landscape. And so considering how, spatial considerations of tick-borne illness related to movement need to be conceptualized within that their host movement, that wildlife spatial ecology side of things. And can you repeat the next part of that question?
Yeah, and in terms of fire, were the treatments fairly similar, mowed versus unmowed fuels, burn unit size?
Yeah. So we have so both sites had areas that were, where have had recent mowing or, more distant mowing. There's different, sites, site sizes. There's a pretty even, there's a gradient across sites. And in any later analysis, we will have to control for those with covariates and other kinds of, statistical devices and frameworks. But both sites did have, some mechanical, some not mechanical, some larger units, some smaller units. Some sites are more close to the edge than other sites are close, they're more interior. So all these things, southern pine beetle impacted mortality. There are some differences that we will have to control for during our modeling approach. So there are similarities, there's differences, and our way around that is to sort of account for those in our statistical approach, which is a work in progress.
All right, thanks. And then the final piece was, and from the plots you measured, how do you scale up conclusions about prescribed burn impacts on ticks at Albany Pine Bush and Brookhaven in their landscape scale?
It's tough. And so in some sense, this research here provides a smaller snapshot of what is going on at these sites. And it sort of can be thought of as this is a baseline. We really do need further research at larger landscape and spatial scales. And that is something we're actively thinking about, working on some grants to sort of think about approaching, other landscapes that have had larger, fire histories, more frequent fire at a larger area. And so as is, it's hard to, say, because we burned, a small quadrant at Brookhaven National Laboratory. So that means we know that, central pine barrens, we burn, will have a landscape effect. It's tough to draw that conclusion, but we can see sort of, where there's smoke, there's fire. There is some kind of indication here that could be the case. And it is an incentive for us to keep on researching to try to draw those bigger spatial scale out, if that answers the question.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks. Next one is from Shlomia. Could you say anything about fire effects on reservoir populations? In my understanding, fire may often be favorable for deer populations, but that with caveats, it tends to reduce populations of small mammals, which, as you said, are better reservoirs.
Yeah. So, this is another sort of it depends question. So if we think about, so let's think about, we'll think about two different tick-borne pathogens and diseases they cause. So there is Ehrlichia chaffiensis, which is typically transmitted by Lone Star ticks, which can cause human monocritter ehrlichiosis. And we'll think about Lyme disease, which is primarily transmitted by, black-legged ticks, Ixodes scapularis, and it causes Lyme disease. And so the host for Borrelia, the reservoir for Borrelia, are mostly those small mammals. You're correct. Conversely, the host for deer, or the host for Ehrlichia chaffiensis, the reservoir for Ehrlichia chaffiensis is deer. And so when we're thinking about host reservoir dynamics, we really have to be very specific about what species, what disease, what pathogen, what system we're talking about. Because to your point, if we're increasing deer, ubiquity, maybe we're increasing the conditions for, Ehrlichia accumulation, so can you just repeat the question one more time?
Sure. Could you say anything about fire effects on reservoir populations?
Yeah. So there is also sort of not too much research about. It's one of the things that I'm sort of looking into is, the pathogen abundance. There is not too much out there, to my knowledge, looking at how fire has impacted host pathogen maintenance. But there certainly is some research or something to be said for that. Yes, different fire has different effects on host populations, and that could have a direct relationship to subsequent, tick infection. So if you have an area that burns and all the small mammals go to one little island or refugia, that can cause a lot of infections to accumulate because everything is in close proximity. So there's a lot of feeding going on. So you have this, isolated island of infection. There is a study that I am aware of that, not in the Northeast, but it did look at something similar. So we have all these small mammals, they flock to this island of refuge, and there was an increased spike of infection there in those animals because they were all together. A deer, you have more deer concentrated together along an edge. You could have more the infected ticks for Ehrlichia. They can sort of flock. They can sort of there's more host to choose from. So that concentration on the edge or fire can sort of increase things also. Not my best answer, but it's something that is still very much a a research gap and something that I am considering in some capacity.
All right, thanks. And we've got one last question from Judith. How does the historic fire pattern interact with the range expansion of many tick species?
Yes. So that is an excellent question. So we have a lot of different things going on here. And so we have a demonstrated expansion of the range of some tick species. Now, interestingly, in some cases, whether it's a range expansion or reclamation, actually is a thing that I try to throw out there. So, for example, a lot of folks talk about how Lone Star ticks are expanding their range, how they used to live down along the southeast coast, and now they're an invasive species up north. But there is some pretty compelling evidence, both in the historical record, that suggests that Lone Star ticks actually used to live around here. There is a record from a Swedish naturalist, I think from the 17th century, who was, I think, in Pennsylvania, and he reports seeing this really annoying tick that had a white dot on its back that was just being a pain in Pennsylvania, and which is outside of the historical range as we thought about it in the past. And he was talking about how this tick is so annoying, and you know and since then the Lone Star ticks are associated with the southeast coast, but there's some ideas that maybe that retreat of Lone Star ticks from the northeast has more to do with changes of their habitat, so deforestation, loss of deer. And so with changing in land use patterns forcing ticks away, well, actually with the reforestation and more deer, Lone Star ticks are coming back. And so in a weird way, you can make the claim that Lone Star ticks returning to the Northeast could be a conservation success story in a weird way. And so, there's, when we think about range expansions and, changing fire, there is this sort of nuance there about, well, is this a range expansion? Is this, an ecological conservation, air quotes there. And so, there are changing fire patterns that are corresponding with these changes in tick populations, and that can, have potential impacts on a lot of different elements of the tick disease system. And so, if you have, novel ticks in an area because of various changes in the ability for them to survive longer in the system or expanding ranges, those tick species then can come into contact with different kinds of hosts, which could expose them to novel pathogenic microorganisms that they are capable of transmitting or retaining, that they can then transmit to other things like people. There are then, you could also have increases in what we call co-feeding transmission. So, I mentioned how deer are not really good reservoirs for Lyme disease, but what can occur is something that's called co-feeding transmission. So you have a whole bunch of ticks in one area on the deer that are feeding simultaneously, even though that deer may not have an active infection with the Borrelia, which can cause Lyme disease. All the ticks eating in close proximity can still, more or less directly transfer those pathogens to amongst themselves. And so, when you have changing temporal patterns associated with changing environmental conditions, you can have, larvae existing at the same time as nymphs, when really historically they didn't exist at the same time. By having them exist at the same time and co-feeding together, you can really have, a lot more opportunity for pathogen transmission. And what this can lead to, how fire interacts with that is, so, fire can promote, maybe there's more deer together, which allow, more co-feeding to occur, or, co-feeding on these small mammals. And so fire can sort of, potentially be thought of as a something that either exacerbates or moderates. Maybe it can, reduce small mammal presence, reduce, tick habitat, which can then reduce these things. And so it's hard for me to say because it is a broad it's very system specific, and it could also, in that system specific, it relates to both the disease side of things as well as the fire ecosystem side of things. So that's another very vague answer, but there's a lot of it depends with larger global with larger systematic things.
All right. Well, thank you, Sam. If you could go ahead and stop sharing your screen, I have one more thing I'd like to share with the group before we close out today. All right, let me go ahead and start this up. So just kind of want to remind everybody that we have one more talk in our fall 2025 student webinar series. It's from Maya, also from SUNY ESF, and you can see her presentation title there, and that will be taking place next Thursday, October 30th. And if you want to register for that, you can use the QR code there, or you can go to firesciencenorthatlantic.org and get information, specific information related to her talk. And if there happens, if you or anyone else you know would like to be a part of the student webinar series and likes this format, feel free to reach out to me. Again, my name is Eric Evanson. My email is nafchelp@gmail.com. And lastly, when you close your browser, there's going to be a very brief survey that pops up, 4 simple questions. If you could take the time to answer those, we'd greatly appreciate that. Otherwise, I'd just like to thank you again, Sam, for your informative talk today. It was greatly appreciated, and I appreciate all of you coming on today to be a part of our student webinar series. And we'll keep this meeting open for just another quick minute in case there's any final questions that anybody might have. Otherwise, thank you again. We look forward to seeing you next week, and have a great day.